Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the 1,775 poems of the Johnson edition of the poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 51, I Often Pass the Village. This is a fascinating little poem. It's another what we call Sue poem, of course, the Susan Gilbert poems. Scholars debate this, but there's about 276 poems specifically sent to Sue. Over 500 total writings when you included not just lines, but as well letters that were sent. So this will fit within that. And we'll read a couple of poems that will be specifically important because of Emily's use of the nickname Dolly for Sue. Now, our assumptions are that you're following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, our playlist here is called Chats with Emily. And I'm hopeful that you've already been exposed to our intro lecture, and I'm hopeful that you have worked with all of our preceding lectures, including we just finished with number 50, I Haven't Told My Garden Yet. Now, to begin this for background information, it's interesting to hear Emily herself make some observations. At 15, she wrote to Abaya Root, her pal, and said, quote, I have just seen a funeral procession go by of a Negro baby, so if my ideas are rather dark, you need not marvel. She was specifically referencing that from 10 until the age of 25, Emily lived in a house on North Pleasant Street, which in the back overlooked the town cemetery of Amherst, and of course ultimately where Emily herself would be laid to rest. And so it's significant that when she looked out the back of her house, she saw the cemetery. And so the village that will be referenced here is, of course, the cemetery itself. Now, in regards to Sue, it's also interesting. In 1852 of April of 1852, when in Baltimore, there was a letter that it was written by Emily, which included the following words to Sue, quote, you won't cry anymore, will you, Susie? For my father will be your father, my home will be your home, and where I go, and where you go, I will go, and we will lie side by side in the, she spelled it, kirkyard, the churchyard, the cemetery. By the way, it sounds a whole lot like the language, of course, of the Old Testament book of Ruth, and certainly Sue would understand the resonances of that. Now, we've commented on Emily's interest in death and dying, her practice of death and dying. I heard a fly buzz when I died. And we're going to be playing a similar game here. However, the focus here will obviously be on Sue. I often passed the village, again, the Amherst Cemetery, when going home from school, that's the Amherst Academy that she attended, and wondered what they did there and why it was so still. Now, Emily's use of the word still, as we've commented in earlier lectures, is profound. I think T.S. Eliot learned to use this word still. What does he say? We must be still and still moving, right? I think that we want to pay attention to that. It's, notice she says it this way, and why it's so still, obviously, the cemetery. I did not know the year then in which my call would come when I would die. Earlier by the dial, then the rest have gone. Now, this use of the word dial is fascinating. The dial of the sun, we could argue. In poem 287, she plays it this way. She says, nods from the gilded pointers, nods from the second slim, decades of arrogance between the dial life and him. That's the only other use of this word dial in this way. And then she says it this way, it's stiller than the sundown, obviously the village, the cemetery. It's cooler than the dawn. The daisies dare to come here, and birds can flutter down. Notice dawn, down, right, and the way she'll play with the language here. Notice the rhythm as well. It's stiller than the sundown. It's cooler than the dawn. The daisies dare to come here, and birds can flutter down. This little sing-songy kind of, in other words, she's dealing with the idea of death, but it almost seems tongue-in-cheek, which we're not shocked for Emily that she will often do. And then obviously the last stanza would begin with the word so. All of this to say, I walk by the cemetery regularly, and I've often thought about the dead that are there. This reminds me, of course, of Gray's elegy from a country churchyard. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net if you want to read that one. So, When you're tired, notice she doesn't identify yet who the you is. When you are tired or perplexed or cold, notice your trinities, trust the loving promise underneath the mold. Cry, it's I. Take Dolly, and I will enfold. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how Sue would receive such a poem as this. The suggestion, obviously, is that Emily dies before Dolly, and then Emily will long for Dolly to then be buried next to her. Now, the use of Dolly here is significant. In poem 158, she'll say it this way: dying, dying in the night, won't somebody bring the light so I can see which way to go into the everlasting snow? And Jesus, where is Jesus gone? They said that Jesus always came. Perhaps he doesn't know the house this way, Jesus let him pass. Somebody run to the great gate and see if Dolly's coming. Wait, I hear her feet upon the stair. Death won't hurt now Dolly's here. In two other poems, we have a similar kind of a game that can get played. In poem 156, it runs, you love me, you're sure, I shall not fear mistake, I shall not cheated wake, some grinning morn to find the sunrise left in orchards unbereft and Dolly gone. I need not start, you're sure, that night will never be when frightened home to thee I run to find the windows dark and no more Dolly mark, quite none. And then she'll finish, but sure, you're sure you know, I'll bear it better now, if you'll just tell me so, than when a little dull balm groan over this pain of mine, you sting again. And then in 1401, poem 1401, she'll play a similar game as well, and it runs like this. To own a Susan of my own is of itself a bliss. Whatever realm I forfeit, Lord, continue me in this. These Sue poems, obviously, most importantly, will play that game of Dolly. The use of the word enfold is also interesting. I've told you guys that there's a lot of hugging motifs and grasping and wrestling and all of that. That's a part of this, much like our study of Walt Whitman in our talks with Walt at learnstrong.net. In poem 253, she'll say it this way: too vague the face my own so patient covers, too far the strength my timidness enfolds, haunting the heart like her translated face is teasing the want, it only can suffice. This idea that I will hold you, I will hug you, Dolly, when you decide to come and join me in death. Well, what are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? Well, I think the argument that she's making is that love, she argues, can overcome death. And of course, the longing for enfolding of the one that you care for is central to this poem as well. At 2B, the use of Dolly as the nickname for Susan makes this poem significant. Without knowledge that Dolly is Susan, it would be difficult to know exactly who she's referencing. At 3A, we mentioned, of course, poems 156 and 1401. We mentioned Grace Country Churchyard, Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And finally, at 3B, as we own a poem like this, well, who is the pal for you that you care for the most? And how will you deal with ever losing them? And how do you imagine they will deal with losing you? Compelling questions. Thank you, Emily.